The Soviet Union itself is no more.
The United States military has begun strikes.
Считаю, что для современного мира однополярная модель не только неприемлема, но и вообще невозможна.
Народные республики Донбасса обратились к России с просьбой о помощи. Мною принято решение о проведении специальной военной операции.
Russian military is taking chips from dishwashers and refrigerators to fix their military hardware. Russia's industry is in tatters.
Putin is now isolated from the world more than he has ever been.
Hispanoamericano, latinoamericano y caribeño.
All right, welcome. This is DD Geopolitics, and I'm your host, John, alongside our host supreme, Sarah. And today we're joined by Carlos Garrido of the Midwestern Marx Institute. Carlos is also the Secretary of Education for the American Communist Party. And then we have Christopher Helali, an investigative journalist, farmer, geopolitical analyst, and international secretary for the ACP. Chris and Carlos, it's great to have you with us. It's been a big week. I know that you guys have been extremely busy over the course of the last 2 weeks. But I wanted to start with the topic of Venezuela. This has been a major news event over the course of the past week. We've seen a ton of propaganda come out from some of the most powerful actors, both in politics and in business in the United States. Of course, we've had Elon Musk really spearheading the charge of disinformation that has been shared all over the internet and on X in particular. And then we recently had the United States government recognize Edmundo Gonzalez as the rightful president of Venezuela. And in the midst of all of this, we're hearing claims that Maduro is a dictator, that the elections were rigged. We've seen a number of ridiculous polls come out asserting that Gonzalez actually received between 60 and 70% of the vote, which stand in stark contrast to a lot of the information that we've received over the course of the last few months and on the ground. And Carlos, I know that you were in Venezuela over the course of the past week during the elections. So I'd love to hear from you a little bit about what your experience was like on the ground and what the election process looks like in Venezuela. You know, we hear all of this rhetoric that the elections are shrouded in doubt and potential fraud. But I would love for you to tell us a little bit about how the elections are actually run and what you saw on the ground in terms of the legitimacy of those elections and the election day itself?
Well, first, thank you, John and Sarah, for having myself and my colleague Chris over here to talk with you all. I just got back from Venezuela 2 nights ago under quite interesting circumstances. I basically had to, I'm not speaking hyperbolic here, kind of flee the country because the hotel that I was in had a spy in it. The whole perimeter was surrounded by opposition thugs. And for a period of time, the passage to the airport was blocked off. So it's very interesting circumstances, those that allowed me to leave when I did. If not, I would have been stuck in a region that I believe is still under a strong influence by the opposition. I was invited by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, along with my colleague Jackson Hinkle, to oversee the Venezuelan elections. It had been the largest delegation. More than 1,000 delegates from around the world were present from all sorts of countries, more than 80 countries, I believe, to oversee the elections. There was panels instructing us on all the different forms that the electoral system, the various ways it operates through. And then we got to see what they told us in the first few days of the trip. We got to actually see it on election day, the 28th. I got to visit like 7 voting booths. And it's an extremely efficient process that's designed specifically to prevent fraud. And I would like to repeat that. The system is literally designed to prevent any possibility of fraud, precisely because they understand that since the opposition does not have a majority of the people, the only way that they can make any attempts to win a majority is by cheating, by actually doing fraud. So already the narrative that we get in America is so upside down. The narrative is that it's the Chavistas that do fraud, but it's the contrary. You know, the reason why Jimmy Carter said it's the most democratic system in the world, it's because they've had to devise so many ways to prevent fraud from the opposition. In yesterday's broadcast, I showed one of the examples of such fraud attempts. There was a president of a coalition of oil producers out of Texas who, when he looked up the voter registration number of his brother, he found it in the database of voters for Maria Corina Machado, the opposition candidate, who of course called on the Zionist entity to invade Venezuela. The only problem is that his brother had been dead for years. So there was a very clear case from someone who wasn't a Chavista, who wasn't a militant of the Socialist Party in Venezuela, a very clear case of literal dead people being counted within the records of the opposition party. It is because it's had to cheat so profoundly that I think today, when it was supposed to present the results to the Supreme Court, it did not present the results, and the Supreme Court simply affirmed the original results. The Chavistas were able to bring their records. They came with the proof that there was no cheating on their part. The opposition wasn't able to do that, and this is something that is repeated over and over and over again every Venezuelan election. There's cries of frauds, of electoral fraud, months ahead of time, and these cries have literally no proof behind them. There's no weight behind them, but what they do have is the microphone of the U.S., which still holds, of course, some sort of dwindling but still existent global power and control over narratives. And that's what they do. They cry fraud months ahead of time. There's no evidence, but the U.S. Promotes it with its media controls. And then the Chavistas have all the evidence in the world to the contrary, including people like myself and the more than 1,000 other delegates who were able to see the voting booths, to see all the different steps, see how there's fingerprints that are required so that, you know, you can't vote twice or vote for someone else. There's paper trails. There's an electronic system that's non-hackable, that's connected directly to the CNE, which receives the results. There's people overseeing the whole process, about a handful of them. And then, of course, in most voting booths, there was delegates from around the world that were there, ensuring that there also wasn't fraud and making sure that this voting system that's extremely efficient at preventing electoral fraud is also efficient at getting people in and out. And that's what I saw. I saw it in opposition neighborhoods. I saw it in Chavista neighborhoods. People were in and out within a matter of a minute and a half at most. It's a system that prioritizes the voting first and foremost of elderly people, of disabled people, of pregnant mothers, of mothers with kids. And so the most disadvantaged, the people who would be worse off if they had to wait in line, those are the people that go first. This, of course, did not was not appreciated in some of the opposition voting booths. There was 6'2", well-built white dudes that my colleague Jackson Hinkle said looked whiter than him, who were protesting that they waited, I don't know, 30 minutes, 40 minutes so that 82-year-old grandma can vote in front of them. But the truth is that, Jimmy Carter was right. It's the most democratic system in the world. It's literally designed to prevent fraud, because that's what the Venezuelan opposition is expected to do, because they have never been able to win over the Venezuelan people on a platform of selling over their country to the U.S. empire, of selling their resources to the U.S. empire, of having a Venezuela that belongs not to Venezuelans as it currently exists, but that belongs to American multinational corporations. That's generally not a winning platform for the people. So they've never been able to garner a significant majority of the Venezuelan masses. This election had an additional weight to it, which is that Venezuela is soon to be included into BRICS. And that, of course, is going to mean tremendous common prosperity, the uplifting of all of Venezuela, but specifically its working people, the uplifting of their living standards. And when that happens, the way that that is reflected in the realm of politics, in the realm of ideas, is through the solidification of the party, of the individuals, of the people that allowed that improvement in living conditions to occur. So the opposition knew that with the joining of BRICS, the Chavista government is only going to become even more entrenched in the civilizational destiny of Venezuela. And they understood that this was their last attempt to come into a position of power. They had been threatening violence for months ahead of time. There was sacrifices of roosters and the parading of dead, bloodied, upside-down roosters across the streets of Venezuela. The symbology is clear, given that the rooster is the symbol of the revolution. What it implied was violence against the leadership of PSUV, violence against the people. They wanted to emulate terror and bring fear into people's hearts and minds so that they wouldn't go to the polls. That's all they can hope for in order to see if they can win. Of course, they were not able to win. The Venezuelan people have no plans of giving up their sovereignty, which was frankly what was at stake here. It wasn't just their 21st century socialism. It wasn't just the Bolivarian revolution. It's Venezuela itself that's at stake. All of these things are interconnected. We understand over there in Venezuela that without this revolutionary socialist development, you couldn't have the platform of sovereignty. You can't have sovereignty if if all of your resources and your people and their labor is controlled by foreign entities that function for the sake of their own private interests and not for the sake of society at large. So the people defended their revolutionary process. They won in the ballots, 52% for Maduro, 44% for Edmundo Gonzalez, excuse me. And of course, the opposition, as expected, has been crying cheating. But now that it was presented with the opportunity to show proof of what it's been saying for months now, it literally did not show up, which was something that was expected. They've been threatening violence, and there have been guarimbas that were established. There have been Chavistas that have been killed. There have been people's officers that have been killed by the opposition. But as it stands right now, everything has been under control. The few thousands of opposition people who hit the streets to protest on the 29th were dwarfed by the millions of Chavistas that came out on the 30th, the 31st, and afterwards, and yesterday. So it's a situation that I think pretty soon is going to be fully under control if it isn't already. And I was there in the darkest periods, and subjectively, it was an interesting experience. The hotel we were in, as I mentioned, had a spy. The whole perimeter was filled with people from the opposition. Our route to the airport was completely blocked off by these criminal thugs. And for a minute there, myself and the other colleagues and attachés, so guides, we were quite frightened. We didn't know if an invasion of the hotel was imminent. We didn't have the forces to be able to protect us from, 200 goons trying to invade the hotel. It wasn't like it was unlikely that they would try to attack a hotel filled with international delegates. They had already tried to bomb another one of the hotels, and it was thankfully captured by Venezuelan counterintelligence. So it was a very scary situation, but thankfully we were able to make it out. There was buses that escorted all of us in the middle of the night. I believe it was at 3:30 a.m., 4 a.m., with the lights off so that we wouldn't be seen. We took a lot of side streets in order to get to the airport, and thankfully we were able to make it safely and leave to our respective countries. There's still comrades from these delegations that have stayed back to do other sorts of missions, and the situation that my friend and comrade Jackson Hinkle is in is quite sticky. A couple of days ago, he was doxxed by Zionist rabid dogs who exposed where he was, putting in danger not only his life, but those of the other delegates that were in that hotel. Very quickly, the Venezuelan opposition came out saying that we have to give this spokesperson of the Maduro dictatorship a warm welcome, which is a dog whistle for burning him, for setting Jackson Hinkle on fire, which is something this murderous, thuggish opposition has done before to people. It's literally set people alive on fire. And it's what they were trying to do to Jackson Hinkle. We have high intel sources that have confirmed that this is what they were trying to do. And thankfully, they were able to relocate him and all the other delegates. But there's a whole lot of people on the left in the US and in the West that, because of their disagreements on tweets, literal tweets that Jackson has put out in the past, are cheering on some of the worst fascistic forces that exist on the planet, that are looking to burn a 24-year-old alive simply because he had the courage to go to Venezuela and report on the truth, which is something that they, as rabid Zionist dogs, are allergic to. That's why they have to lie. That's why they have to manipulate information. And then when it comes time to actually showing proof, they have absolutely nothing.
Well, I want to ask you a little bit more about that in a second, but I also just feel like it's so notable that the claims about Venezuela's election have been steeped in this narrative that all of the propaganda that people like Elon Musk are putting out is in the promotion of democracy, right? But then, of course, you have these gangs, roving gangs in Venezuela, who are literally, like you said, intimidating people who were election observers, who had the exact function of trying to operate as impartial and independent parties to help oversee the process. And again, I haven't really, seen many elections in the recent past that had as much attention and focus and international observation as what we saw in Venezuela. But I would like to ask you, Carlos, before we kind of transition to another subject, I would like to ask you about the nature of the opposing political forces in Venezuela. You mentioned running into a number of opposition forces, but I also wanted to ask you about the Chavistas and what the nature of the people, like the rank and file Venezuelans and Chavistas who support Maduro, what they're like and what role they played in all of this over the past few days. And then maybe tell us a little bit about both the internal forces, the internal opposition, what the kind of the class character of the opposition is inside the country, and maybe give us some insights into where they align outside of the country. You alluded to Zionists, many of these people being rabid Zionists and so on. But I was hoping that you could say a few more words about that.
Yeah, when you go as a delegate for your own safety, they give you these guides that are called attachés, and you're not supposed to escape their grip. And I was able to, on a few occasions, to walk around more humble neighborhoods in Caracas and talk to people and look, folks, I'm not being hyperbolic when I say that I was able to speak to hundreds of people, and anywhere around 80, 85-ish% of the people I spoke to were going to be voting for Maduro. They were down with the Chavista process. There was comrades who went to other parts of Caracas and other parts of Venezuela who did similar experiments and kept notes. And the statistic that I heard from this one Argentinian comrade was that 89% of the people he interviewed out of a pool of 152 were with the Chavista government. Of course, when we go out there, we don't take the international delegate pass. We try to go dressed in a way that blends us in, that doesn't connect us to the government anyhow, or to the Chavista forces as impartial observers. And that's what I saw. I saw a lot of Chavez shirts. I saw specifically the one with his eyes, which is kind of an iconic logo of sorts. I saw a lot of Maduro shirts, a lot of shirts with the image of the ruling party, which is the rooster. I saw a lot of shirts that symbolized the slogan of the campaign, which was, let's dare to have a future, a very future-oriented slogan. I don't remember the specific slogan now, but there were shirts with imagery about the future and continuing the Bolivarian process. The people I spoke to, it's very interesting because I got a chance to go to both opposition and Chavista neighborhoods to see the voting booths, and just the character of the people was telling. In the more humble neighborhoods, the Chavista neighborhoods, a lot of the people were around my skin tone or a little darker. They were humble people, working class folk, farmers, very much clearly in favor of the Chavista process. They couldn't speak politics within the voting booths, of course. They couldn't wear any of the party clothing, but it was clear what side they were on. They were very, very kind to us, often offering us drinks and foods and candies and chocolates and all sorts of things. They were trying to keep us longer than we were supposed to be there, just to hang out with them. They were asking us all sorts of questions, and very kind, good-hearted people. Now, in the opposition neighborhoods, what I found was something completely different. This was the context where my colleague Jackson Hinkle said, "Holy crap, these people are even whiter than me." And if you know Comrade Jackson, you know that says a lot. It was usually wealthier people from the sectors of Venezuelan society that actually benefited from Venezuela being a colony of the imperialist West and the U.S. A lot of these people were rude. They were basically Karens, right? That's a term that's been popularized in the U.S. The entitled blonde white woman. That's how a lot of these people acted. They acted very entitled. I gave the example of the older people and disabled people that were supposed to vote first. That's not something they appreciated. They felt entitled because of their economic standing and social class to go first, and complained very much about how long they had been waiting in line. Then look, there was people in Chavista neighborhoods that waited the same amount of time, but had a completely different attitude to it. They didn't feel entitled to have to go in and out and not have to stand in a 30-minute line. A lot of these voting booths, they had 3 or 4 voting areas, and each one, there was 800 to 900 people that would pass throughout the day through those. So we're talking about thousands of people that would have to come in to vote in very small schools. The efficiency that they showed, considering those conditions, was tremendous. But for the opposition, it was, these people were rude. Sometimes they would scream at us. There was a comment, a question that I was asked along with the other delegates that I was with. It was not a question I ever thought I would be asked. I was asked if I knew how to dodge Molotov cocktails, because the opposition has been fond in the past of wrecking voting stations, specifically when it comes closer to 6, which is the official closing of the voting booths. Of course, they don't close them until everyone gets through, but they try to show up late to wreak havoc and have often thrown Molotov cocktails into voting stations. We've seen these people over the last 3-4 days burn buildings, burn small businesses of people who were with the opposition and then flip because the opposition thugs have burned businesses that they have worked very hard to lift off of the ground. They've burned headquarters of the ruling Socialist Party. They're criminal, terroristic arsonists, frankly. So I was asked that question, which I never thought I would be asked if I knew how to dodge a Molotov cocktail. And there was a comrade who jokingly asked if I, in that moment, recalled the dodgeball scene where they give you a series of acronyms of how to dodge, duck, dip, dive, something like that. I was ready. I was ready to duck, dip, and dive to avoid getting burned alive by opposition thugs. Look, the opposition was able to garner around 44% of the vote. I would be lying to you if I said that everyone in that 44% was a bourgeois scum. That's not the case, of course. If not, it would be the first society on the planet where 44% are part of the bourgeoisie or upper middle class. There are genuine discontents that parts of the Venezuelan working class and other lower, poorer sectors of society have felt. Those are discontents, of course, rooted in the criminal blockade the US has imposed on Venezuela, like it's imposed on Cuba and Iran and any country that dares to exist outside of the US imperialist sphere of influence. Venezuela has still 930 sanctions imposed on it, criminal, unilateral, coercive measures that are strangling Venezuela. And what we've seen over the last 5 years since the peak of difficulty in 2019 is improvement. In those last 5 years, Venezuela has been able to become food sovereign, an incredible feat. From having 1% of its food produced by itself to being able to fully feed itself with its own resources. It's an incredible development. Its growth has been the number one in the whole region. So it's been able, even through this strangling blockade and sanctions regime, it's been able to grow and improve the living standards of a lot of its people. But of course, because of colonial legacies and the vicious hybrid warfare on the Chavista process, there's still people who could, be living a whole lot better. And out of those material difficulties, naturally, certain forms of discontent arise, and those are discontents which are channeled in various forms of false consciousness because of the influence of the opposition. And it's an opposition that does not act autonomously. It's not as if the opposition says, look, we're Venezuelans, we want a different vision for Venezuela, and we're going to act on it. The opposition are puppets of the US empire. That I have absolute certainty. These are people whose political practice, ideas, vision for the future, policy, all is crafted out of Washington. So these are not agents that are sovereign. These are not agents that are autonomous. They are controlled and manipulated by foreign forces who have their own private interests at heart and not the interests of the Venezuelan people. So the Venezuelans knew, the vast majority of them, that this was a fight for sovereignty, that one side represents a Venezuela that is autonomous, that can forge its own future, that if it makes mistakes, it can critically reflect and then correct course. And the other side that represents the absence of autonomy and the complete capturing of its future and its destiny in the hands of foreign forces that do not have the interests of the people at heart. Of course, there's a critical 20, perhaps, percent of the opposition that are from the working class and have various forms of false consciousness. But I imagine that with the joining of BRICS, the improvement of their living conditions, the fulfillment of the promises the Bolivarian process has put forth, that whatever base the opposition had in the working class and lower sectors of society will be completely stripped as soon as the growth and common prosperity that's going to come from BRICS ends up materializing itself.
Yeah, those are fantastic points, Carlos. And, I'm really just struck by how strong and decisive the narratives are in the United States about the voting process in Venezuela. Specifically, this accusation that we hear all the time that the standards when it comes to Venezuelan elections are not in line with democratic standards internationally. When, of course, we know full well the role that corporate power, big money plays in our own elections. We don't even have voting day as a national holiday in our country. Yet in Venezuela, they go as far as I saw a number of videos where you can't even buy alcohol on election day because they want people to participate in the democratic process. So
They
it's
have
just
they have a dry law 3 days before the actual election and until 7 p.m. the following day, which as tourist wasn't my favorite law. But I respect the commitment to free, fair, and sober elections.
Apparently, they also have free public transportation on election day. Our friend Angel is here from Venezuela. Yeah, wow. Imagine.
And everything's closed. Everything's closed because they want people to vote, right?
Mhm.
In the U.S., how many people have not voted in many of the past elections because they're literally working? In Venezuela, is a national holiday. There were stores that have been closed 2-3 days ahead of time. They're not going to be taking any big hits because it's all basically subsidized by the government, and they want people voting, which is not something I think we can say here in the U.S. And it's completely shameful. It turns the world reality on its head when the horrendous standards for even a basic process such as voting, like we can question the reduction of democracy to just voting, to participating in voting booths every 2 to 4 years. That's, I think, if we reduce democracy to that, we're screwed already. And American philosophers such as John Dewey have made it clear we have to think about democracy as a way of life, something consistent. But even in that sphere, the level of democratic accountability, the freeness, the fairness, the uncorruptibility of the process in Venezuela far exceeds what we've seen in the U.S.
And so now this is the second time in less than a decade that the United States has recognized someone as the president of Venezuela who is not actually the president, who is not functioning as the president, does not hold the office, and will not be leading Venezuela in the years to come, which I think undermines the credibility of U.S. leaders even further, if it could be undermined further because of the hypocrisy that we've seen in support of the Zionist entity in the Levant, and obviously a number of other major hypocritical actions that they're constantly undertaking. But as you mentioned, Carlos, one of the notable things here is that a number of governments, though, have recognized the legitimacy of Venezuela's elections. Very prominent governments, by the way, who are leading the emerging multipolar world, including Russia, China, Iran, all have recognized Maduro's election victory. And I wanted to actually bring in Chris on this point because something that we hear all the time when it comes to the enemies of the United States ruling elites, the rabid Zionists, is that these governments are inherently dictatorial or authoritarian or totalitarian. Yet in many cases, especially in the case of Russia and China, we understand that they have broad consent from the mass of people. And so, Chris, I wanted to ask you about the significance that you see of the emergence of new poles of power in the world, particularly in Russia and China. And Carlos spoke to this a little bit, but I'd love maybe for you to go into a little bit more detail about how these governments, you were recently in Russia, are looking at the actions and the events in Venezuela and how they view the United States' unilateral decision to designate someone else as the president who did not actually win the election. So I'm wondering if you could give us a few thoughts on this, and yeah, just kind of broadly how this emerging multipolar world sees these actions and what the implications of all of this are.
Certainly, of course. And of course, I'd like to begin with my condolences and sympathies to the families of the martyrs. In these past few days, it has been heavy on those of us from the Middle East. And of course, we extend our solidarity to the Palestinian resistance, which continues the fight against the Zionist entity and Western imperialism. As you rightfully mentioned, I just got back from Russia, and also I was in Georgia and the Balkans. And of course, it's critical to understand one thing in particular, that everything that's going on now in Venezuela is seen in Moscow, and I think throughout the former Soviet Union, as something through the prism by which they have experienced these before. You can say sort of like a Groundhog Day, deja vu. They've experienced it in Minsk, they've experienced it in Kiev, they've experienced it in Tbilisi, they've experienced it in Central Asia, in Kazakhstan. We've seen color revolutions throughout this entire region, from Eastern Europe down into the Balkans and all the way over into East Asia. We have seen the Western imperialists continually pushing their people, pushing the opposition, quote unquote, which is considered by the West free and fair, but is actually owned and operated by Washington and Brussels and many other centers of Western power. And they cannot but help and see this and think, this is what we experienced. This is what we experienced in 2014 in Ukraine. This is what we experienced in the crisis in Georgia in 2007, 2008. This is what was experienced just a few years ago in Belarus, right? During the elections. And you had all of this hubbub about what was going on. And I think that they can only see this and say, isn't this a tired playbook at this point from the West? I mean, I think that the people around the world are slowly waking up and realizing this. And I think that the emergence of, as you rightfully point out, this multipolar world out of the ashes of, sort of those final years of the Cold War and the 90s, which were for many Americans quite peaceful and economically strong and good years. But for Eastern Europeans, for people in the Middle East, for people in Central Asia, and of course, people in Russia who lived through this period known as Katastroika, a combination of catastrophe and perestroika. These were horrific years. These were years where many people died and suffered. And of course, the U.S. began its sort of liberal humanitarian mission. It's a continuation of Manifest Destiny to go and bring democracy and human rights to Yugoslavia. And then, of course, into Southwest Asia, in North Africa, everywhere they possibly could. So in thinking about what's going on in Venezuela, and we've seen the playbook there. I was there in 2019 during the height of the crisis when the Trump administration was putting, as my comrade Carlos rightfully points out, maximalist pressure on Venezuela. These sanctions, these really harsh coercive measures that were not used to punish the government, but were used to punish the people, to make them de facto agents of regime change. That's what they want ultimately. They've made it very clear, not only the ghouls like Elliot Abrams, but also your John Boltons and Mike Pompeos, who have emphasized this in any country where they are applying sanctions, that the goal is to make the situation of the people so untenable that they will rise up against the government that actually is in their best interest, because the situation has become so dire and desperate. But of course, the Venezuelan people have once again shown the world that they are in command, and that their revolution will not be tampered with from the outside or from within. The emergence of the multipolar world, as you put it, something that's been happening now, and in your intro, you rightfully put some clips, especially Putin's famous speech during the Munich conference. This emergence of different poles of power has always been the norm in international affairs. When there was a Roman Empire, Rome might have considered itself the center of the universe, but there were other empires around the world, whether it had communication with them or not. Different parts of the world had different spheres of power around major dominant imperial regimes, or various groups that had gotten together to form polities. So 1991 is a very unique moment, I think, in world history, because in the nuclear age, you really had one geopolitical and economic system that came out on top, and that praised itself for coming out on top, without really looking in the mirror and realizing that it only came into the top because of various other forces and contradictions that didn't mean the end of history. It simply meant that we have a little bit longer to go before we enter into a much more peaceful and harmonious world system. So 1991 until really 2001, that decade really was a period of, sort of what they call Pax Americana, like the Pax Romana or the Pax Mongolica or the Pax Britannia. You have this moment where this imperial hubris, of course, takes over, and now the United States can be in its own glory and say how it has been anointed from on high. Of course, we know that it has not been anointed by anybody, but its own delusions. And so with that, you had, of course, what we call imperial overreach. So, of course, the Chinese were still there. The Russians were still there. Many of these other powers were still living under sanctions regimes. The DPRK was living under a sanctions regime with Kim Jong-il in power at that time. You had Iran living under a sanctions regime. You had Iraq at the time with Saddam Hussein, Gaddafi in Libya. Many of these countries, of course, Cuba has been under a blockade, a criminal and genocidal blockade since the 60s. So the multipolar world was always underneath what was this unipolar world. It was there. The non-alignment movement was still a powerful force for many countries. But of course, they couldn't match the United States in military might or in economic might at the time. Now, of course, we enter into a period, and having just returned, we've entered into a period where U.S. sanctions, U.S. coercive measures on these countries have had a boomerang effect, have had what the CIA rightfully calls blowback. In trying to quell any sort of government that doesn't kowtow to Washington, what they've ended up doing is fusing all of these countries together. China and Russia share, of course, a long history as two civilizations bordering one another, centuries, if not millennia, given the shared history of the Mongols and the Golden Horde and other polities that have existed, that have merged the two civilizations. But in this particular instance, the Western imperialists have brought these two countries not only together, but in a strategic and comprehensive way that links the two's destinies together, that they recognize that they cannot, be without one another if they are to confront the United States and the United States' allies. The same is true for other countries. Now, of course, DPRK just entered into a strategic comprehensive agreement with Russia, the highest level it's been, even when the Soviet Union was around, it didn't reach those heights. So now what we are realizing, what I think many people are commenting on, is the failure of U.S. sanctions and coercive measures and the failure of military power. Because, of course, we have to look back at the history of these past almost 3 decades now, and to look back and to see what has come of U.S. military force around the world. And what has come has been the destruction of stable countries and very well-off countries, by the way, like Libya. And, of course, the strengthening of so-called enemies of the United States. The United States went to overthrow the Taliban, and the Taliban today in Afghanistan is stronger than it ever was before. And so I think that many countries around the world are looking at this and saying the U.S. is not only a paper tiger, as of course the famous quote from Mao goes, but it's a force that can easily be stopped if there is union around economic issues, political issues, and military issues, which it does the reverse of the encirclement, because of course the global south is the global majority. So if you can bombard the imperial centers from the south, you've strangled them. Where does the US get its supplies and raw materials? From the south. So I think that the perspective now in Moscow, in Beijing, in Tehran, in Caracas, in Havana, in Managua, wherever it might be, it is that the United States is experiencing a terminal decline at this point. It will always remain a power. This is the conversation I had with Dmitry Peskov, Putin's spokesperson in March at the World Youth Festival in Sochi, Russia, where he said to me, of course, the US will remain a strong power, but the US will remain a strong power in its own region, in its own sphere, like it was during the time of the period of the 16th, 17th, 18th century in Europe, where different polities had their spheres, and others didn't necessarily mess with those spheres. The US will have its sphere, but of course, with the multipolar world, there's a dynamism to the interactions. In the technological age, there's a much faster way of communicating and transacting and doing business with all of these countries. And therefore, I think that the old model of imperial dominance is coming to an end. And I think that you're seeing this rising up, this tide, this sea change, which cannot be stopped now. And so I think that Venezuela, what we're experiencing in Venezuela today, is once again another stop to the imperialist machinations of Washington and its allies, and really the show of force that the people will not tolerate outside interference, and that they want to pursue their own path, their own destiny, and they want to continue the Bolivarian revolution. That was the dream of Simón Bolívar for a strong, sovereign, Venezuela, a strong, actually, Latin America, really, against the Spanish Empire. And so that's what we're experiencing today. And these countries want relations with Russia. When I was there in 2019, actually, at the airport in Caracas, there were Russian military planes. Of course, they had flown in 2 nuclear-capable bombers there, and the United States lost its mind. But how come the United States loses its mind when the Russians land 2 planes in Venezuela, but the United States doesn't recognize that giving arms and F-16s and tanks and billions of dollars to a fascist regime in Kiev also is bothersome to the Russians? You see the double standard, the hypocrisy. The world has, woken up and has seen what's really going on. And I think that that's the key to this sea change. The dreams of the 90s, that somehow all of these countries would become liberal democracies, and that was in their best interest, and that they would pursue a path similar to the United States. It was all lies. It was all merely for the plundering of these countries. And that's what ended up happening. And that's what built these oligarchic classes. They're pushing back against that. And I think that we're in a profound sea change now. And what's to come is, I think, very exciting, although dangerous given what the US is doing in Venezuela, in Ukraine, in, of course, Israel, and around the world.
So, Chris, I wanted to ask you a question about Georgia specifically. I think within the last 24 hours, the United States actually said that they were cutting aid to Georgia in response to their foreign agents law. This is now we're seeing economic warfare. It was interesting because while you were talking, one of our viewers said that economic warfare on Venezuelans, and now I'm thinking now they're starting economic warfare on the Georgians. How will this affect the Georgians? Will it push them further to the east? And sort of what kind of aid does the United States supply to Georgia that this will affect?
So from what we understand and what I've been told by comrades in Georgia is that this is a large aid package that has been almost yearly signed off by the United States. And there's an aid package that goes to civil society. It goes towards strengthening institutions and other aspects of Georgians' political life. Now, what's happening now in Georgia has a history. And of course, a lot of people might not remember that history. A lot of our younger viewers, I remember it vividly. I was in college at the time when it was going down. But when the collapse of the Soviet Union occurred, and of course, I think a lot of people are familiar now with, not 1 inch eastward and all of these kinds of talking points that were given by the US to the Soviets. Really, for the Americans and for the Europeans, the Caucasus became an integral part of their plans. Why? Well, the Caucasus, of course, is the soft underbelly of the Russian Federation. If you can foment discontent there, you can, in a way, enact a sequence of events and changes that could hopefully bring down the government in Moscow. That was the goal. And the goal was a rapid pincer movement, not only from Eastern Europe, of course, the classic borders being the Baltic states, Poland, Hungary, down into Ukraine, right, and the Balkans, but also that soft underbelly where you could use whether it be Turkey or other countries, to get in there from the Black Sea and to push up through the Caucasus. And of course, the Caucasus countries being Azerbaijan, Armenia, Georgia, and of course, the states within the Russian Federation, right? which include areas that the United States has also fomented chaos in: Chechnya, Ingushetia, Dagestan, areas that have a history with the Russian Empire before that is a lot more complicated, and of course has religious, ethnic, linguistic dimensions to it. So Georgia today, as it was 2 decades ago, finds itself within the crosshairs of NATO once more. Because when I was in Georgia and I was shocked being in the capital in Tbilisi, the flags everywhere were not only Georgian flags, they were European Union flags and they were NATO flags. And of course, plenty of Ukrainian flags as well, because the elite in Georgia are divided over whether Georgia is closer historically to the Russian sphere and should remain Russophilic, should remain within that sphere, or is Georgia a European country and does it belong to the West? I think, of course, historically speaking, Georgia has always been within the sphere, not only of Russia, but of Byzantium, of the Orthodox sphere, and it has that rooted within its history. And so there's no really going beyond that. Maybe in the fantasies of some liberals in Tbilisi, you can move beyond that. But the population there is firmly within that history. Georgia in 2007, 2008 experienced a crisis under the leadership of Saakashvili, who was pro-EU, pro-NATO, pro-West. They tried to solve the situation in Abkhazia and in South Ossetia, 2 regions of Georgia, which declared independence from Georgia after the liquidation of the Soviet Union, because they didn't want to be part of the Georgian state. Of course, Russia was involved in this and tried to maintain peace and security. Once Georgia began to do moves towards NATO, and of course to solve Abkhazia and South Ossetia through military intervention by trying to go and force them from being autonomous regions into integral territorial regions of Georgia, the Russian military got involved. They saw this as a tremendous threat on their border. And of course, they went in, just like they went into the Donbass, not because of imperialist agenda. They went in to protect the citizens of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. That was for them the most important part of this, because the Georgian sort of idea was that Abkhazia and South Ossetia do not deserve their self-determination or their national liberation, and that they need to be brought into the fold, and that meant, of course, through violence and through atrocities, and the Russian Federation couldn't tolerate that. So now enter into today, where you have now Abkhazia, South Ossetia as separate political entities, albeit recognized by very few countries around the world. Hopefully there will be a political solution to this, but a political solution in Georgia can only come by Georgia declaring neutrality, by Georgia declaring that it doesn't want to join NATO and that it wants to remain militarily neutral in the region. So long as some parts of the Georgian ruling class continue to advocate for NATO, and that NATO continues to pour in tremendous resources into the Georgian society, into the Georgian political establishment, into the Georgian think tank network that exists there, there's going to be instability in the region. And of course, many have said, and I just said at the anti-NATO protests in Washington just last month, that Georgia is the next hotspot. And of course, we've been seeing a renewed conflict in the region, not only with Georgia, but you have to think of it more holistically. You had the ending of the Republic of Artsakh in Nagorno-Karabakh, where the Azeris came in, right? And the hundreds of thousands of Armenians left. This situation had been unresolved since Soviet times, since the dissolution period. That was then taken over, and Azerbaijan has retaken it into its territory. And of course, you still have ongoing issues in the Caucasus region of the Russian Federation, where ethnic and religious tensions are being fomented from the outside. By the way, it's important to recognize that these networks of Salafi and Wahhabi and ultra sort of versions of Islam that come from the Saudis and the Emiratis, the niqab, for example, the covering that only shows the eyes, is something from the Arabian Peninsula. It has no history in Dagestan and Ingushetia Chechnya. Now it has been imposed from the outside through vehicles like different masjids and foundations that are funded by the Gulf states, and those Gulf states, of course, are linked with the United States, and we know of this history with Daesh and everything over the past few decades. So it's important to think about Georgia as part of a region that is now firmly within the sights of NATO. And from the Georgians that I'm very close to, including the leaders of the opposition in terms of the Russophilic, the opposition that existed under Saakashvili that now has some relationship with the government now, that wants to remain close and doesn't want to necessarily go to the West, they have said that it's a very dangerous situation on the ground. And they have seen that there are parts of society that are preparing for another color revolution. There is discontent amongst sectors of the ruling class. That's the big fear here, is that we're going to have a situation like a new Maidan, and the money being taken away is but the first step in the imposition of certain characteristics and ways of doing things that the West has always done, that they're now going to try to first take the money away and then impose maybe sanctions on some individuals, and then they're going to say, oh, democracy is being curtailed, everybody out to the streets, right? That's the big fear. But ultimately, I think that Georgians overall, from the Georgians that I spoke to on the street, do not want conflict. They do not want war. They do not want to turn into the next Ukraine. What they want is they want a peace and stability in the region. And that ultimately means not pursuing a path to NATO, but pursuing a path that balances the interests of the society, both West and towards Russia and the East, and trying to figure out how Georgia, as a small nation, can thrive in that kind of environment. But it's a difficult needle to thread in this situation.
Well, Chris, I love that you brought us there to the point of sovereignty. These regions attempting to maintain control over their history, over their culture, over their way of life, yet being confronted with this unipolar power, with a military alliance in NATO that is basically trying to force one narrow ideological frame onto the entire world, the frame of neoliberalism. And for those who don't comport with that, as you mentioned, they're the subject of sanctions, hybrid warfare. The role of NGOs, like as you mentioned in Georgia, is extremely pronounced. But I wanted to kind of take us back to Venezuela, because I think it's important to consider whether we're thinking about what's going on in Georgia, whether we're thinking about the victory that the United Socialist Party in Venezuela has recently experienced, what the significance of this is to the working class in the United States, because of course we're under assault from the same forces that are trying to impose this rigid ideological order onto the rest of the world. These foreign entities who want to impose their ideology are doing the same thing to American communities, where you have major financial monopolies, corporate major conglomerates who are foreign to the communities themselves. They're foreign to the neighborhoods, foreign to the cities, yet are often the ones who own all the land, own all the homes. And so I wanted, Carlos, to ask you about this a little bit. Like, what is the significance of the victory that we saw among the Chavistas in Venezuela? And what are the implications here for the U.S. working class?
Yes, something that my colleague Chris was just referring to, the hubris of the U.S. empire. It's very interesting when I hear the speeches from Blinken and other war criminals in the American administration. What comes to mind is Pericles' funeral oration for Thucydides. It's like, very boastful, a lot of hubris, but for an empire that's literally about to fall. And I think, so if we can look back 50 years from now, those speeches will be looked at in a very similar light. The question you just asked me, John, is one that I tried to hammer out the day of the elections. I was on Telesur and I got to speak about this topic. And one of the points that I made sure to emphasize was that this victory was not just one for the Venezuelan people. It wasn't just a victory for the United Socialist Party of Venezuela, This was a victory for multipolarity at large. This revolution in the global system that we're seeing, which is what multipolarity is, we should not undermine it. It's a global revolution in the logic that underpins international relations and the logic that underpins how countries produce their own reproduction. This revolution is not going to happen just in one massive jump. It takes various leaps, and what the Venezuelan elections of the 28th of July represent is one of those leaps, one of those great victories, which will generally accumulate into a general epochal shift that I think that we can already see present. So Venezuela's victory is one that I'm sure was celebrated in Russia. I'm sure it's a victory that was celebrated in Iran, in China, in Cuba, in Vietnam, in Laos. In the up-and-coming multipolar world, I'm sure it's a victory that was celebrated by our comrades in Palestine and in the axis of resistance at large, because we realize that we're fighting the same monster, the same vampires that seek nothing but to extract the resources of our land, to super exploit our people, to keep us poor, to keep us indebted, to keep us desperate, to keep us addicted, to keep us alienated and depressed and anxious. The same vampires that do that to us here at home in the US are the same people that send hundreds of billions of our tax dollars to neo-Nazis, that carry out a genocide in Palestine, that try to promote a terroristic, thuggish opposition in Venezuela. So when those elements are defeated, it's not just a win for our friends in Venezuela, it's a win for our side in general. And that's, I think, a point that as American communists, we have to always be capable of making. These victories for the multipolar world are not just victories for the people that carried them out directly. They're victories for the American working class too. The American working class should look cheerfully on the fact that the Venezuelans affirmed sovereignty on the 28th, that they affirmed the continued existence of the Bolivarian revolutionary process, because it's a process that seeks to dismantle those same forces that have made our lives very desperate, impoverished, and indebted. So we have to realize that we're in a very similar predicament here as Americans. If what the Venezuelans affirmed on the 28th was sovereignty, the ability to forge their own future, we have to realize that a very similar fight is ahead of us. The American people do not have sovereignty. The American people do not have the capacity to collectively decide their own future. They cannot forge their own destiny within the ruling apparatuses of American society and the state. It's going to require a qualitative transformation of the way the apparatuses, the structure of society look, in order to create the conditions where Americans are actually sovereign, where we actually have a government, a society that's of, by, and for the people, and not of, by, and for interests foreign to the nation, interests foreign to the people, interests rooted in a small clique of very parasitic people who require nothing more than to continue accumulating their capital and to continue seeing the increase of numbers in bank accounts to the detriment of the livelihoods of millions and millions of, and even billions of people. So the struggle that Venezuela was able to successfully continue, the 28th, is one that represents a victory for us as well. I'm sure that the American working class doesn't just yet see it that way, but it is our job to help them see it that way, to help them recognize that it's the same fight that we're waging, and when they win, we win. When they lose, we lose.
I want to go back to Chris as we round out our time here. Chris, I'm really grateful that you brought up recognizing the sacrifices of the martyrs in Palestine and across the axis of resistance in your opening remarks. And I wanted to go back to Palestine to finish us out, because over the last week, we've seen a number of extremely aggressive actions by the synthetic Zionist entity known as Israel. Specifically, their bombing of a neighborhood in Beirut, their assassination of a top Hamas political leader in Iran, things that normally would be red lines. I mean, if any of these things happened in a Western country or a country that was even aligned with the United States, we'd be seeing these acts on loop, on an endless loop, all across the mainstream media. But of course, that's not the case. It takes people like us to bring them into the fold on social media and online in order to get people to recognize what is happening. But what does it mean, Chris, for the Palestinians to continue to fight right now? What does it mean for really the soul of the anti-imperialist struggle and our struggle at home? And what will the ultimate defeat of the Zionist entity mean for all of us?
I think for sure, as I said in just last month in Washington, that today every principled anti-imperialist, every principled revolutionary is under the banner of the Palestinian people. There is no question about that. The Palestinian flag is not only the flag of the Palestinian people, it's the flag of a worldwide struggle for liberation. It's a struggle against imperialism. And that's what my Palestinian comrades continue to tell me in all of the political factions, regardless, secular, communist, Islamist, doesn't matter. What matters is this struggle against imperialism and colonialism, a century in the making, that everybody who has a conscience can resonate with. Everybody can. The whole world is with Palestine now. The whole world. Only a small minority of countries who have not a consciousness, but are evil, really, in my perspective, evil to see what's going on and what they are carrying out, the weapons they're giving, the kids they're killing. And as a father, I know Carlos also a father, I can only think of my kids. I can only think of my children every night when they go to bed, that it could have been us. I'm Iranian. It could have been us. It could have been us. And so the fact that today Palestine is on the lips, is on the tongue of every person around the world of conscience is something historic. When I, growing up in a Middle Eastern family, of course, half my family being Muslim, when I grew up and, Palestine was always a dinner table conversation. But at that time, Palestine and Palestinians for Americans was a first and second intifada. They were all terrorists. Yasser Arafat's always wearing keffiyeh. He looks like a madman. And it was never to be taken seriously. Israel was always the victim. But you can only play the victim card for so long. How can a nuclear power play the victim card? I mean, this is the worst geopolitical gaslighting I've ever seen. And so in this time period that we're living in, I believe, regardless of what happens on the ground, Palestinians have already won. They've won the hearts and minds of the entire world. And so regardless of the land, the people themselves embody the land. The land is never going to be a colonial power's land. And I think that today the resistance is gaining ground because at some point the Zionist entity is going to have to ask, do we integrate them into our polity and change forever this idea of Jewish state and become either one democratic secular state or something to that effect? Or do we commit mass genocide, kill them all, expel them all? But how can the world sit by and allow that? How can it be conscionable for them? And by the way, it's not only an attack on Palestinians. The other half of my family are Orthodox Christians. It's an attack also on the Christians in that region. It's an attack. Palestinians are not only Muslim. There are many Orthodox Christians, Catholic Christians, Protestant Christians. They are realizing that they are also being oppressed. They are also being, kicked out from their land. Churches are being attacked and things like that. This is an attack on the freedom and the humanity of an entire group of people, regardless of political affiliation, religious affiliation, or so on and so forth. I think that today, the Palestinian people are the canary in the coal mine for the anti-imperialist forces. That whatever will happen to them will happen to the rest of us. If the Palestinian people are not given the resources and the support necessary to be victorious, who's going to be victorious on our side against these forces? These are the same forces oppressing us. It is our government here in the United States that is responsible for what's going on over there. The Zionist entity would be nothing. It would disappear tomorrow if it was not for US support. The US gave them the nuclear weapons that they needed. The US continues to provide the arms, the 1,000, 2,000 pound bombs to level Gaza, to turn it into a parking lot, as some people like to joke about here in the United States. And like they joked about during Iraq war and during the war in Afghanistan. But you know what? The people are resilient, just like the people in Afghanistan and the people in Iraq threw out the Americans, and in Iraq continue to try to throw out the last of them. There's still a few left, right? The people in Syria, a heroic struggle, right? The people in Lebanon, another heroic struggle. The people in Libya, the Palestinian people will be victorious one way or another. But like they told me, it might take the last Palestinian giving the last drop of blood for us to be victorious. But they will be. Nobody is going to deny them that. The only thing that will deny them that is death. And so I think that today, any principled anti-imperialist is not only on the side of the Palestinians, they're on the side of the axis of resistance. Whatever your political disagreements, we can have political disagreements about different governments, different situations, and things like that. But the principle now is that this fight is existential. This fight is for the liberation of the Palestinian people, and therefore the entire axis of resistance must be supported fully, without question. We can talk about things after, when we're victorious. When we are sitting on our laurels and we have liberation, then we can talk about all of the nitty-gritty details of state building and social building and what it looks like. But right now, the critical thing is to stand with the axis of resistance and to continue to hold high the banner of the Palestinian people. And I don't want that banner be taken by people who are playing double sides, who are like, oh, Israel has a right to exist, two-state solution. What two-state solution? There's no two-state solution at this point, in my mind. It's not possible. Where? How? Even the Palestinians themselves are starting to realize this was all a farce. Even the more liberal ones who were believing in two states for so long. It's not possible anymore. What is possible is an end to a racist and apartheid regime and the creation of one state for Jews, for Muslims, for Christians, for atheists, for everybody, but a state that doesn't prioritize the well-being of one group over the other, and that allows for the freedom and participation and the right of return for all the people who were expelled from that land, who still hold the title to that land, right? We talk in this country about property rights. That's the biggest property rights violation. The Nakba. All the people had the deeds from the Ottoman Empire and from the British Mandate. This is the paper. It says it's my house. They still were expelled. You love property rights? You're a businessman, Trump, or whoever gets in office? Give them back their houses and their property. It's theirs, right? It was stolen from them. That's how I feel about the situation. That's what we need to be focused on now. And the American people need to be made aware that the Palestinian struggle is not something far away. It's our struggle as well. It's the struggle of the American working class as well. It's the struggle of American patriots in 1776 who fought against a brutal empire. How strange is it that we became an empire after fighting an empire? But that's the course of history. People need to be made aware of this and to reclaim what has been lost.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much, both of you, for spending so much time with us this afternoon. Chris, can you tell us where to find you and what you're looking forward to?
So you can find me at Chris Helali on Twitter. I'm looking forward to continuing to grow and expand the American Communist Party. I'm looking forward to really being a force for good and a force for change in the United States, in our communities, in our families, and of course to continuing to build ties with the entire international communist and anti-imperialist movement, and to continue to build ties with one another. That's the most important thing. Thank you.
Absolutely. And Carlos, tell us where to find you and what you're working on right now.
Well, thank you, John and Sarah and DD Geopolitics for having us on. Again, it's been a pleasure talking to you. I don't have any public social media, so you could just find me at the Midwestern Marx Institute. It's just Midwestern Marx on every social media platform. And also, please do make sure to follow the ACP Twitter account. ACP Maine is the @ The American Communist Party is the party of the American people, of the American working class. It's the party that if you are a patriotic American, a real patriot, not some fake super patriot, real patriot, you should be supporting this party, which is a patriotic party, a party that is going to represent the American people, our most sacred and positive and revolutionary traditions, and use those to forge a future for us where we actually have a society, the society we were promised, the society we believe in, a society of, by, and for the future, a society that can only be realized by American communists. So make sure to follow us on Twitter.
And Carlos isn't going to plug his book, but I'll plug it for him. Everybody, please go and check out and buy Why We Need American Marxism. It's about 100 pages, pretty short, and a great synthesis of American history and why we need Marxism to move this country forward. So thank you so much, Carlos and Chris, and I look forward to talking to you both soon.
Thank you both, and it's always good to have you, Carlos. Chris, I really look forward to hearing more about the Balkans. That's my wheelhouse too. We love the Balkans. We're mostly Slavs here. Cletus, thank you so much for showing up to work again. And this is a really great quote somebody left in the chat. Elections are just the entertainment division of the military-industrial complex. That's a quote from Frank Zappa. Thank you all, and I want you guys to enjoy the rest of your weekend. We will have a space probably about an hour from now, and we will see you on Monday morning with Marwa Osman if the world doesn't blow up, inshallah.
Inshallah. Thank you so much.
Thank you.